Okay, hi everyone, welcome. This is a really great space. I'm actually really honored and pleased to be able to be here tonight. I just came from doing another presentation right before this. So my mind plays tricks on me sometimes when I do that, like, did I say that already or not? And then I don't also have cameras normally following me around in life at all. So that adds another layer of weirdness to all this for me. But my style is to be lighthearted because we're talking about heavy stuff. And I think considering where we are, we understand that. And that perhaps we also understand that like some humor is necessary to digest these issues sometimes. And so I attempt to, insert that where I can. I'm not a comedian, but we need to have a bit of a lighthearted approach when we're talking about 6 people dying every day in our province. And when we're in high anxiety or fear about that, or we're worried about our own loved ones perhaps, it's very hard to digest new information. And I'm a person who, yes, as you already heard from Shannon, comes from addiction. I was addicted to heroin for nearly 15 years, and I would like to share some of that story with you a bit tonight and what that journey was like. And I'm also someone who changed my mind a lot on issues related to substance use and the crisis that we're facing right now. In fact, 20-some years ago, I was like viciously anti-harm reduction. And I know harm reduction is something we'll talk a little bit about tonight. It's a complicated, nuanced topic that gets a lot of bad press and good press. Well, there's a lot of division and polarization in this topic. And so my hope and my intention is building bridges. Is actually moving us from a place of black and white thinking, which is where a lot of us just start when we start on this issue, to one that's more in the gray and building nuance into our thinking and whatnot. So my goal, first of all, tonight is to present the context of the overdose crisis. So what's going on? This was declared a health emergency 9 years ago. 9 years is a very long time for a health emergency. In fact, I don't think health emergencies go on for 9 years. This has kind of now become status quo, right? It's just the way things are. And so when it's just the way things are, then one thing that emerges is a lot of blame. And so if you listen to the news or you listen to any politicians, that's all you hear, right? It's some other guy's fault. He caused this. It's his problem. If we were to really explore that, I would say we need to expand our historical lens and go back way, way further than maybe the last 4-year government or 7 years, and maybe go back 100 or 120 years. And it's very interesting. While we won't have like a lot of time to dive into this, a lot of our drug laws are a result of really bad racist policies. And if we look at 1908 and the railroad workers that were from China working here in Canada, there was a lot of anti-Chinese sentiment going on in that time. And one of the cultural connections that they had was to opium. Opium is a pretty potent drug that comes from the opium poppy, of course. And we're going to talk, obviously, about opioids quite a bit tonight. But what happened was that one of the first drug laws in BC, or in Canada, was directly aimed at Chinese immigrants because of opium. And really, gave white people a pass. And this is not the only law that's rooted in those kinds of policies. And I guess our hope maybe was that we wanted to reduce the harm of drugs because many people look around themselves, and I think all of us know someone whose life has been maybe altered forever. They're no longer with us, or changed in some dramatic way because of substance use. And so we're familiar with the pain narrative, and we're familiar with the destructive narrative that substance use offers. And oftentimes the result of that is what? Drugs are bad, right? Drugs are bad. Who agrees with me? I'm about to enter in with the nuance, right? So I think we've all probably said that. I think we all kind of default to that way of thinking often. I'm here to maybe offer drugs are not bad, nor are they good. They're just drugs. And that the context, the reasons people use them is the far more interesting part. So, I'm curious, who here uses drugs? You put your hand up nice and high.
Talking pharmaceutical.
Okay, so you want the nuance as well, do you? Actually, I asked that question obviously tongue-in-cheek. I don't expect a lot of people to put their hand up. You know, every presentation I go to, it's never more than one or two. But my next question is, who is willing to share that they consume alcohol? There's always far more hands that go up for that question. I'm just curious, you do know alcohol's a drug, right? Okay. So I don't know, I think we forget that sometimes. We almost play a game, right? And we've created a way of othering people who use certain substances, right? So if you consume alcohol and you just think to yourself for a second, I am a drug user. And then ask how does that feel? Or how does that sit with you? I'm going to imagine not particularly comfortable. I don't think most of us want to go broadcasting. You wouldn't put in your social media status, I am a drug user. But you might put a picture of a nice bottle of wine in your social media status. So there's an interesting, what that sense is when you say or feel that awkwardness or that uncomfortability with the idea of I am a drug user. That is stigma, right? That is how we understand that stigma separates people and creates hiding. So in my years in addiction, which was a very kind of a 15-year journey, up and down, I hid it the entire time as best I could. Of course, people knew, and I had family and friends that were attempting to support and help me throughout that journey. But for the most part, I hid it. And I didn't dress really any differently. I was never homeless. I never even lost a job as a result of my substance use. I managed to maintain employment and work and be housed and have a vehicle throughout all that suffering. And it wasn't any less suffering than what you might see in the unhoused visible component of this crisis. And for most of us, that actually is kind of our only perception, is what we drive by on the street, right? You can't see me in my house alone, struggling. 72% of fatal overdoses in the province right now happen in private residences. 4 out of 5 happen to be men. Men in trades are one of the groups that are most dramatically impacted, trades and transport, which is an industry that I've been a part of most of my life. I've been a residential painter for over 20 years. And so I've witnessed and been a part of a culture that has a lot of substance use embedded in it. Work hard, play hard. Men go off to the oil fields and they're disconnected from, their primary social connections. And what's the recreation in the oil fields, right? Well, it's just drugs and alcohol. That's all there is. And so it's not a surprise that these things embed themselves in different places in culture. Now, drug use is part of all cultures, through all societies, through all of history. It's not new. It's not a new problem. And so we need to understand that drugs are with us. And perhaps when I go back to that nuance of thinking drugs are neither good nor bad, there may be actually some opportunity to even consider the benefits that drugs have brought to society. Now, as you mentioned, pharmaceuticals are drugs as well, and a very key and useful drugs. Part of what we have and need, right? The medical system. We use drugs in those contexts all the time. And in fact, the drug that is driving this crisis, primarily fentanyl, and I'll talk more about that in a moment, is a safe and useful medicine in and of itself. It was first synthesized in the 1960s. It's on the World Health Organization's list of essential medicines. It's used every day in hospital settings safely. It's administered to women who are receiving an epidural during labor. So we give them fentanyl, and we have naloxone on standby in case we need to administer that to the baby after birth, after they're born. So we know how to use a drug like fentanyl in a safe way. So what we're really dealing with when we think about this crisis is actually a crisis of regulation versus unregulation. The illicit market is unregulated, right? It's uncontrolled, or it's controlled by criminals who really don't give a whole lot of care towards quality control. They don't put labels on their products. It's just the quantity and quality of the substances fluctuates by the day. And that really is the issue that's driving so much death in this province. So when we go back, and if you take a look at this graph here, it actually shows the overdose deaths in the province all the way going back to 1996. And if we went back even further, even into the 80s, it really is pretty much just a straight line. So about 250 to 300 people would die from a fatal drug overdose in a given year. But it stayed pretty steady. So it didn't get flagged as a major issue. It was kind of the way it was. All of a sudden, 2015, 2016, that really spiked. And we went up to almost 1,000 overdose deaths in that first year where we declared a public health emergency. So it tripled in 1 year. And that was obviously got the attention of public health and our coroner, and they declared a public health emergency in April of 2016. But even since declaring an emergency, the numbers have not diminished or gone down or stabilized in any way. They've continued to climb. And in 2023, we were actually up here, around 2,330 deaths that year. So that's a massive change from 300 to 2,300. And it's driven entirely by one thing, and that is a supply-led change in the drug supply, where heroin, the classical opioid that was, in demand by people who used opioids, was pushed out for the much more profitable, easier to make, easier to smuggle fentanyl, which is about 40 times stronger than heroin, right? And so for cartels, for organized crime folks, the cost of doing business is people die. But that's it to them. They don't care because fentanyl is outrageously profitable. So remember how I mentioned opium, where we get heroin, grows in poppy fields in only certain climates, certain parts of the world, which means someone has to plant it, someone has to take care of it, someone has to harvest it. We need a chemist to convert those poppies and that opium into heroin. We need a supply chain to smuggle it into the country. It's a lot of work. And once a kilogram of heroin lands on the shores of British Columbia, it's worth about $50,000 or $60,000. Fentanyl is not made from poppies, it's synthetic. And so it requires only a few chemicals and one person, a chemist, to convert those chemicals into the substance fentanyl. And 1 kilogram of it could be worth as much as $1 million. So from a business perspective, this shift in supply is kind of a no-brainer. But from on the ground perspective, there was never historically a demand for fentanyl. People didn't really want it. When you think about substance use, most people want mild substances. This is why beer and wine are way more popular than whiskey and gin and rum, right? Most people would prefer to be in control of their experience. Fentanyl is so powerful that dosing accurately is almost impossible, especially from the unregulated market. And not only can you not dose accurately because of how potent it is, you also really have no idea how strong the substance in your hands is. It changes all the time. So let's just imagine for a moment that we're making chocolate chip cookies. And we're gonna bake our cookies, we're gonna lay them out on the pan, you mix up your batch. How many chocolate chips? You didn't want me to pick on you, right?
Extra.
How many extra. How many end up in each cookie though? Like, is it pretty precise? Is there exactly 12 chocolate chips? Because that's the right number. But no, it fluctuates, right? We're home chefs. We don't have systems or technology to make these exactly the same. And so they're different. Each cookie's different. And the cookie that has only 6 chocolate chips in it is no problem. But the one with 12 is the one that can cause someone to die, right? This is essentially what's happening in that illicit supply. So people historically were not dying, as we've seen. But now with the fentanyl emerging, It's so potent, it's just causing people they're taking substances that they don't know what they are, they don't know the strength of it, they don't know what's in it, and it causes them to die. About 100 years ago, people were noticing some people struggled with alcohol, and it was creating problems in society, right? And so the teetotalers came around, right? Does anyone know one of those? They're still around. They decided that prohibition would be a better way. Well, alcohol is causing problems. Let's make it illegal, right? And of course, it follows that as soon as we make alcohol illegal, everyone stopped drinking. Not at all. It seems so obvious, in retrospect. And of course, it was a lesson we had to learn. And it feels as though we might actually be needing to learn this again. So as soon as prohibition was put in place, it actually incentivized Al Capone, right? I mean, he didn't have a job before that. Al's bringing beer into Chicago. And he's got his wagon, and he got his barrels, and he's thinking, this is such a great business. I'm going to come in late at night, sneak this wagon in. I got enough beer on here for 100 people down at the speakeasy. And then, his business is going good, and then Al's scratching his head thinking, this is not enough profit for me. And he's thinking, that same wagon, I can put moonshine in there instead. Same wagon, same size, takes up the same amount of space, but I can get 1,000 people drunk with moonshine, right? So his profits just increased 10 times by switching to a more potent product. And that more potent product is smaller, right? Consumes less space in the same way that fentanyl consumes less space. This idea is called the iron law of prohibition. So academics have very thoroughly studied this. And the iron law of prohibition essentially states, as soon as we make a substance illegal, the illicit market will spring up, and more toxic, dangerous versions of that substance will be made available in the illicit market. And essentially, that's exactly what we're seeing with fentanyl. The true question from researchers is not, why did we have an overdose crisis begin in 2016? It's more, why did it not begin sooner? Because fentanyl is not new. And so I think crises like these will continue to evolve and emerge. We are hearing a lot about nitazines, probably a drug no one's ever heard of here, which are beginning to emerge in the Eastern Europe and then moving into Europe. And that is a direct result also of the heroin supply being disrupted over there. So the Taliban has taken control of Afghanistan poppy fields, and they've burned most of them. So because the heroin is no longer available and the stockpiles are running low, suppliers are switching to synthetics, right? So there's been a notable uprise of synthetic, or what are also called research chemical substances, over the last 30 or 40 years. And it's anticipated that this will probably continue. Criminals are always looking for a way around laws. And in America, they use what's called a scheduling system to classify certain drugs into certain categories. And the Schedule 1 is for drugs that are of no use, for no purpose, for no one, right? Cannabis used to be in that schedule. So obviously, we have updated and revised some of our thinking on some of these things. But that scheduling reinforces stereotypes and stigma, right? So that's what I want to talk a little bit more about, is the stigma that I was experiencing when I was hiding my substance use and was not wanting people to know. Why did I feel that way? Part of the reason is connected obviously to that idea, drugs are bad. But more than drugs are bad, people who use drugs are bad. And when we think about where a lot of the policies that I've already shared about with racist roots and with ways of kind of designed to get undesirables to the edges of our society or even out of our society, and we associated that with drug use. As a result, 100 years later, without thinking about it, all the cultural programming we've taken in, all the movies we've heard, all the terrible PSA advertising that we were exposed to in the 80s and 90s, it has actually influenced us in a way that many of us, without even being conscious of it, simply think people who use drugs are bad people. and it's perpetuated itself throughout society. And as a result, we have a judgment, or we are inclined to judge without even thinking or knowing. Stories, right? There's fascinating research that shows that it's difficult to be curious about someone if you're already in judgment, right? So for most of us, maybe the way this crisis touches us, and I don't know your story or your family situation, your relationships and the people you know, but a lot of folks, what we see is the visible part in town. And that's our perception of who's at risk. And I think the data clearly shows us that the risk is amongst us. It's amongst our friends and family. So I was reading some research that shows that in Canada, in 2020, we consumed 120 tons of cocaine. That's how much they estimate was imported here. Do you know how much that is? It's about 19 lines per adult. Wow. That's a lot of cocaine. You wouldn't get that sense that there's that much cocaine being used in Canada from walking down the street or from hanging out with your family and friends or anything like that. It's all hidden. It's all hidden. And there's some very intriguing research that shows that actually most substance use is not problematic. And I think we really need to digest that even amongst and within thinking about other substances. So a researcher in the States called Dr. Carl Hart, who's a neurophysicist and a tenured professor, wrote a book called Drug Use for Grown-Ups. And in it, he discloses his own recreational, occasional, responsible heroin use. And it was pretty vulnerable of him because, I mean, he is tenured, but I think that's like career ending for some folks, right? And the fact that he was willing to do that, I think can really begin to shift the way our society thinks about these substances, right? So which drug do you think is the most harmful, both to the individual and its impact on society? Oh, we have a smart group here tonight. That's great. Yes, of course, alcohol, the most popular drug by far, but also the harm that it causes to users and society is massively bigger than what we experience with this opioid crisis. Far more people die from complications related to alcohol and alcohol use than are dying in this crisis. But we don't even talk about that. It's not part of the conversation. In fact, beyond not talking about it, we have laws that encourage alcohol companies to advertise and promote their alcohol as much as they want. If you watch an alcohol commercial, it's always a good time. Nothing ever goes wrong, right? Is that your experience? So I share all this simply to set the stage for rethinking about how we understand substances and our own interaction with them as adults and the substances we use. So another drug has been recently made legal in Canada, 5 years now, just over 5 years. That's cannabis. And there is a cohort, there's a demographic of people in the country of whom, after legalization, cannabis use really went way up, like that, skyrocketed. Which demographic am I talking about?
Moms.
Moms.
Probably the people that were already using it.
Actually, it's senior citizens. Yeah. So yeah. So 60 plus, the cannabis use went way up. And so it's very fascinating to think that we see how the stigma is being removed from that. And we see how people are making personal choices of preference. I think for some, a choice to maybe switch from alcohol to cannabis was actually a harm reduction decision. And so that's something that we're witnessing. And when we look at a graph of drugs and the harms, when we rank them in terms of harm that they cause to self and others, from worst to least, alcohol is at the top. Crystal meth and heroin are up there near the top as well. Cannabis is about in the middle. And then psychedelic drugs like psilocybin, magic mushrooms, LSD, these drugs are right at the bottom. Very incredibly safe use profiles and very low risk, and actually deemed anti-addictive in some situations. So but most of us, if we queried the room or you wanted to share some stories, we've heard some pretty crazy things about drugs that are just not true. Like, I heard that if you do LSD 3 times, you're clinically insane and you have holes in your brain. But it's not true. You could do LSD too, even at your age. It's really safe. So there's lots to learn, there's lots to explore, there's lots to rethink with this issue. But when we look at the crisis that's happening right now, it's a crisis of people simply taking drugs that they don't know what's in it. So I just took a look the other day at data from across Canada on people's urine screening. So what they did is they had people say, tell us what drugs you took or you think you took, and then we're going to screen your urine and we'll tell you what drugs you actually took. And many people were reporting that they had consumed heroin, and 0 of them had. None of them. So that's what they believed that they were buying, or believed that they were getting. But what they actually got was fentanyl. And not just fentanyl, often. So even beyond fentanyl, the supply has gotten really contaminated, and we're seeing other drugs showing up in there and other substances that are harmful, really harmful for the body. And another substance that's showing up a lot is benzodiazepines. So these are anti-anxiety sedative drugs that are very powerful. And when combined with opioids, they really knock a person out, right? So often that's complicating some of the way we respond to overdoses. And we'll talk about that a little bit when we get into the naloxone training portion. Does anyone have any questions so far, thoughts, ideas?
So what happened in 2016 that made it spike, and why didn't it spike earlier?
Yeah, so there's probably no answer about why it didn't spike earlier, but that is basically when fentanyl was introduced to the supply. So somebody somewhere brought that substance in, and those systems are fairly controlled by some pretty intense power hierarchies, few powerful individuals, and so that was a decision someone might have made. And what has happened since then is that because, like I said, there really wasn't a demand for fentanyl. It wasn't a drug that people were asking for. Most people, if they wanted to use an opioid, they would not really want to use fentanyl. But now we have a whole group of people who are truly dependent on it. And so now they have actually created the demand. So there is a demand for fentanyl now because so many individuals are dependent and wired on it. Another really important piece in just understanding the drug supply is the cross-contamination component. And so what that means is that fentanyl is showing up in drugs that you definitely wouldn't expect it to be, right? Stimulant drugs. Opioids are central nervous system depressants. And so a lot of the drugs that are in that class, we've probably all heard of some of them: fentanyl, Percocet, Oxycontin, Dilaudid, hydromorphone, Tylenol 3, codeine. Codeine is an opioid. So that is the same class of drugs as fentanyl, has the same effect on the system and on the body, but obviously is much, much more mild, right, than fentanyl. So opioids are widely used in medicine and for pain and for treatment, but the stimulant drugs, cocaine, crystal meth, these are not a class of drugs you expect opioids to show up in. They do the exact opposite, right? Opioids are known often on the street as down. Stimulants are known as uppers. They take you the other direction, energize you, right? Get the blood pumping, get the heart moving. And so when you have fentanyl showing up in these drugs, these people are often naive to opioids, definitely not expecting opioids, maybe not even aware that that's a possibility. And that is leading also to a large amount of death. Now, another really salient point, and this is one I really like to, I think is important when we're having this bigger conversation. When we talk about overdose death, it really becomes a conversation about addiction very quickly. And even tonight, like obviously we're talking about addiction and I'm sharing my story. If you listen to this issue on the news, kind of the conversation right now is really focusing in on the treatment and recovery side of things and how you need more supports and services in that area. And often it's set up as a conversation like either or. We either need more treatment and recovery support or we need more harm reduction and kind of safer supply conversations and this kind of thing. And obviously, I think it's not either or. I think it's both and. But what I want to say is that the addiction side of this is actually, like, even though it's intertwined, it is a separate issue. Let's just say, for instance, we manage to help all the people in this country who have addiction tomorrow, and we got them all into a program or getting some supports. We would still have a toxic drug crisis because there's a whole bunch of hidden people that are using drugs and probably don't qualify for a substance use diagnosis, wouldn't go to treatment, don't need treatment, etc., right? And so these people exist. I think it's it's kind of obvious when we think about people in our lives who consume alcohol. I imagine that the vast majority of those people do it responsibly, that they're consuming it in appropriate ways, that they're making good decisions about how much and how often. And that is actually, that experience can be extrapolated out to other substances as well. So when I think about this crisis and where we all fit into it, my focus is on this idea of playing a role. Because I don't think any of us can change and bring this to an end. Not only that, I don't think it's going to come to an end anytime soon, because there's really no frank conversations about addressing and kind of how we could address and change what the actual drug supply is, right? So that the drug supply was less poisonous. So that the drug supply was at least not killing people. And if it was at least not killing people, then we would have time and space and opportunity to help them, right? So fascinatingly, my story really maps onto the data for opioid addiction quite nicely. If you look at average experiences for people who develop an opioid use disorder, it lasts about 15 years, which was exactly about how long I was in it. And those individuals also enter treatment about 5 or 6 times. I think I did too. And that means they also leave treatment 5 or 6 times and possibly re-engage with the illicit drug supply during those in-betweens, or what we've called relapses, right? And so that means they're highly at risk for overdose and death. So even though we need more treatment and recovery resources, holding them up as a solution to this crisis is an error, because many of those individuals will leave treatment. Well, all of them will leave treatment. And that doesn't mean they're never going to use illicit drugs again, right? And so we need to be creating safety nets and working on harm reduction for the folks in the middle, right? I left treatment and used drugs again many times, right? But thankfully, fentanyl was not present. Most people, and I mean, of course, I had family and friends that were worried about me dying, because that fear is embedded in our culture. We worry in that way, right? But I mean, truthfully, was I really at risk? Not compared to how people are at risk today, right? Not compared to that. So when we think about providing more support to people, we do need to do more treatment and recovery. But we also need to learn about and make more accessible harm reduction. And what is that? Harm reduction is a principle. Most of us might think of things like needle exchange or a safe consumption site when we hear that term. But beyond that, it's a principle. It's just an idea. We all actually practice it. If you drove in a car here tonight, you did something risky, right? And so you probably also did a couple things to reduce the potential harm, like putting on your seatbelt, right? Turning on your headlights. All the safety mechanisms that exist in modern vehicles designed to reduce harm. That is the essence of harm reduction, right? If you go out on a boat on a lake, well, you should wear a life jacket. It's safer, right? Because boating is risky and dangerous and should be illegal. Because then no one will do it, right? So we're needing to become somewhat more pragmatic about our approach to substance use and thinking maybe more honestly about the role that substances play in our society. And part of that might even mean, and I was going to get there earlier, thinking about the benefits of drugs, the positive. Because I've talked to people who think, and have shared with me, they feel that our society, any society, would be better if drugs weren't part of it. I don't think that's possible, but I don't think it would be better anyway, right? I think a lot of the music and technology and art that we all enjoy was inspired by people who use drugs. It's true. And so Steve Jobs claims he figured out the iPhone on LSD. And he's not the only one who had insights of this nature from using substances. So substances, as I said earlier, are neither good or bad. It's perhaps about the context of use. And that leads us to become curious, I hope, about the context of use. What is going on for people who are struggling with substances? Historically, we've thought, well, it's the drugs. Just stop using drugs. Drugs are bad for you. If you just stop using drugs, then your life will be better again. This is essentially the message I got for many, many years. And it seems obvious, does it not? I think it misses the point and it misses the person. And by being preoccupied and focused on their behavior, their drug use, we actually don't get an opportunity to find out who they are and what's happening with them and in their lives. And we arrived at this very reductive way of thinking about drug use and addiction from some pretty bad science that took place, about 75 years ago, where we took rats, we put them in boxes by themselves, we gave them water and drugged water, cocaine or heroin, and then we just watch what happens. And in those cages, the rats try the water, they drink the drugs, they like the drugs, they keep going back for more, they compulsively use the drugs, and they even overdose and die in some cases. And so the scientists said, drugs are dangerous and bad and risky and cause addiction, obviously. And that was the end of the story. And that was really the cultural narrative for a very, very long time. And then we had another scientist come along in the 60s here at SFU named Dr. Bruce Alexander, and he decided that was pretty bad research. And that he wanted to take another look at it. And so his idea was actually to create Rat Park. So rather than put rats in an artificial environment in which they don't live alone in cages, he put them in their natural environment, a playground for rats with all the rat activities and rat things and boy rats and girl rats, and so they're hooking up and they're all in there together with water and with heroin and cocaine. And in that environment, while they do sample the drugs, they all try it. None of them return to it compulsively. None of them overdose and die. And this created a paradigm shift in the way we think about addiction. That historically, it's been only the drugs. But now we understand from a nuanced perspective, it's much more about the person's environment. And what is a person's environment? A person's environment is their childhood, is the world they grew up in. It's things like, and Sheila here often speaks to adverse childhood experiences and the way that those impact on a person, and the research that has been done that shows that the higher number of adverse childhood experiences a person goes through, the more potentially negative health outcomes occur later in life. Some of those things include addiction, heart disease, stroke, diabetes, etc. Just all sorts of mental health issues of things are correlated with the experiences people have in childhood. There is also really good research into positive childhood experiences which create resilience and insulate people against the harms that can come from these adverse experiences. But so that means person who cares for them, someone who shows interest, someone who's present, right? A teacher, a parent. These things can insulate a person, create resilience, and help them overcome difficulty in life. But when we think about those pain experiences, Dr. Gabor Mate is a famous addiction doctor in Vancouver. He says, the question is not why the addiction. The question is why the pain? What is the pain in that person's life? And remember, I said, if you kind of had that automatic tape running from our childhoods because we've been programmed by that drugs are bad, drug war cultural narrative, it's very difficult to come with curiosity to explore a person's story because you're already wired to just be in judgment against it. And so this is where we must begin, building our nuanced thinking into our lives, and maybe even becoming vulnerable ourselves in talking about our own experiences with substances and what that was like for us, whether it was positive or negative. The Greek root pharmakia, for which we have the word pharmacy, was a dual meaning word. It meant poison and cure. And so again, context of use. Drugs clearly can poison, destroy, ruin lives. But at the same time, used in healthy and responsible ways, they seem to be able to be very beneficial for some people in some contexts. And there's amazing research emerging that shows that psychedelic substances like magic mushrooms, MDMA, LSD, ketamine, these are being used even to treat people with addictions. They're giving them substances, and it's helping them overcome their addiction through integrating talk therapy and different modalities along with a substance. And people are having very profound experiences that give them dramatic insight into their lives, into why they do things, and then the brain becomes very neuroplastic in the weeks following an experience like that, where people are able to integrate new ideas and new practices into their life. And so that for me, when I learned of that, was also a paradigm shift, because when I came out of addiction, I came out with a very kind of narrow understanding that abstinence is the only path forward. And I think that can be true for some people. But what we really need to do for the people that we're helping is give them agency and empower them to choose a path that they want for themselves. I, for far too long, had people telling me what path I should go down, how I should get better, where I should go, what I should do. And I had almost no one ever curious enough to ask me, what do you want to do? What would you like to try? Where would you like to go? And if I had been presented maybe with a larger menu of options, I wonder if I might have had some insights and developed a bit of self-awareness earlier on, right? So we want to help people through that journey, because they can come out of it. Here we are, an average 15-year experience maybe for an opioid use disorder. But most of the people who are struggling in that regard right now might not live 15 years to come out the other side, right? So that's why my efforts and my energy and my interest is in creating policies and safety nets and around harm reduction and stigma reduction that will keep people alive. Because if they are struggling in that way, I have hope for them, but I need them to stay alive to get there, right?